Good morning, and thank you for being part of this extraordinary event in our AUB New York office in the Depth Center and on campus at AUB. Our Board of Trustees has just met this morning and we're going to continue to be meeting. We're now joined by distinguished guests, members of our International Advisory Council, students and faculty in Beirut, and of course by our speaker and award recipient, Professor Freeman Dyson. Welcome also to Mrs. Emmy Dyson, and thank you both for traveling here from Princeton today to be with us. No thanks for administering a beating to my beloved Eli's this weekend. You can see the enthusiastic group on the screen. Chair of AUB's Physics Department, Professor Jihad Duma, an extraordinary faculty member and scientist himself, recently awarded tenure. He's been just moderating a panel today at AUB on Professor Dyson's contributions to science and society. He's joined by Professor Taman Amin, Chair of the Department of Education. Dr. Imad Barghouthi added a message by video from East Jerusalem about his personal experience of Professor Dyson's commitment to science. We've invited Professor Dyson to be AUB's first recipient of the Presidential Science and Humanism Award, which we will present to him in a ceremony later this evening at the Morgan Library. The award is a new one and a unique one. It recognizes professional research of the highest quality, but also personal example that reflect AUB's cross-cultural, multidisciplinary legacy and mission. The award emphasizes dynamic scholarship that challenges and expands established boundaries, highlighting the quest for humanity's self-preservation, dignity, and spirit of respectful engagement among people everywhere, but it also recognizes fully freedom of inquiry and courage in humanitarian legacy and in human philosophy. Indeed, Professor Dyson's scientific inquiries have enlightened generations of men and women about the mystery and the order of our universe. While his personal example inspires them and their nations to be guided by humanistic values, he has ventured towards distant galaxies to explore the nature of the cosmos. But he also is human enough to marvel and write about the beauty in trees and birds and violins. He stretches the boundaries of knowledge in mathematics and quantum electrodynamics, in astrophysics, and other scientific arenas, while simultaneously exploring the mysteries of faith, ethics, and human nature. The techniques he used in physics form the foundations for most modern theoretical work in elementary particle physics and quantum many-body problems. He's made highly original, important contributions to an astonishing range of topics, from number theory to adaptive optics. But also, he's been someone who's taken strong, courageous positions. His strong public criticism of the government of Israel and support for Dr. Imad Barghouthi of Al-Quds University, who was detained twice by Israel, is a reflection of his courage and his ability to stand up for that which is really right and that which is really just. It is in AUB's interest and our honor to be associated with Professor Dyson. He is a scholar who understands the full extent of scholarship as the search for the truth. He is a public activist and a public intellectual, a writer and a scientist. While AUB is honored to honor him with this award because his life exemplifies the life of the mind and the life of the soul, he also honors us with his presence today. I'd like to now invite Professor Dyson to talk to us about biological and cultural evolution, 6 characters in search of an author. Following his talk, journalist Rami Khouri, who's here with us today in New York, and being a good sport as his Yankees lost to my Red Sox, will moderate a Q&A with our audience in both Beirut and New York. Professor Dyson, we are truly honored to have you here with us today, and we thank you for sharing your creative thinking.
Well, thank you very, very much, all of you who have been part of organizing this affair, and thanks for everything you're doing for me. I apologize for reading from a script. If I didn't read from a script, it would take even longer. And as it is, I'll just get ahead with it. So in the Pirandello play, The 6 Characters in Search of an Author, The 6 characters are actors who arrive at the theatre to begin rehearsing a play. The theatre manager apologetically informs them there's been a misunderstanding and he has no play for them to rehearse. He begs the actors to go home, but the leading actor refuses to leave and starts improvising a play, making up the story as he goes along. One by one, the other actors join in, each of them pushing the story to a different, unexpected direction. And at the end of the performance, all of them are fully engaged, and together they bring the story to a dramatic climax. I borrowed Pirandello's title and used his characters as a metaphor for the pioneers in our understanding of the concept of evolution over the last 2 centuries. Until recently, evolution was considered to be a biological process driven by the slowly acting forces of speciation and extinction. Speciation is the birth of new species. Extinction is the disappearance of a species that dies out without leaving descendants. Our first character, Charles Darwin, published his great work, The Origin of Species, in 1859. He demonstrated from observations of species in the wild and from the effects of selective breeding of plants and animals that natural selection is a powerful force for driving evolution. Darwin himself was well aware that nature contains many mysteries that his theory does not easily explain. There is a mismatch between the real world, with its amazing richness of diverse species, many of them obviously burdened with superfluous flowers and feathers, and the theoretical world of Darwinian evolution, in which only the fittest should survive. Naively, we would expect Darwinian evolution would result in a world with a much smaller number of species, each of them selected by superior fitness to be a winner in the game of survival. All through his life, Darwin was puzzled by the abundance of weird and wonderful species that looked like losers but still survive. In light-hearted words, but with a serious concern, Darwin asked the question, why did the Creator have such an inordinate fondness for beetles? I call this question the Beetle paradox. If only the fittest survive, we would expect to find a few hundred, maybe, species of beetle adapted to live in various habitats. But Darwin looked at the real world and found 500,000 species of beetle, most of them showing only superficial differences from their competitors. Everywhere he looked in the real world, he saw an extravagant variety of species with elaborate structures that are expensive to maintain. The theory of evolution by natural selection would tend to treat creatures plain and simple, but nature appears to prefer creatures that are complicated and beautiful. Darwin knew nothing of genes. He was unaware of the work of Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk, who worked in his monastery garden and did experiments on the inheritance of pod color in peas. Mendel discovered that heritable traits such as pod color are inherited in discrete packages which he called genes. Any act of sexual reproduction of two parents with different genes results in offspring with a random distribution of the parental genes. Heredity is a random process resulting in a redistribution of genes between parents and offspring. The numbers of genes of various types are maintained on the average from generation to generation, but the numbers in each individual offspring are random. Mendel made this discovery and published it in the Journal of the Brünn Natural History Society, 7 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species. Mendel had read Darwin's book, but Darwin never read Mendel's paper. So I skip a bit because I wrote more than I have time for. Mendel's essential insight was to see that sexual reproduction is a system for introducing randomness into inheritance. In peas, as in humans, inheritance is carried by genes that are handed down from generation to generation. His simple theory of inheritance carried by genes predicted a ratio of 3 between green and yellow pods in the third generation. He found a ratio of 3.01 with 8,000 plants. He had to use this big sample to get any kind of statistical significance, which he understood the laws of statistics, which Darwin did not. So this gave Mendel confidence that his theory was correct. The idea of genes remained generally unknown among biologists until 20 years after Darwin's death. Darwin imagined various ways of mixing inherited traits of parents and distributing them to offspring, but he never imagined genes. Without the concept of genes, it was impossible for him to calculate correctly the rates of speciation and extinction in any natural population. He had the good sense not to make such calculations without having a theory of inheritance. He had no way to guess reliably how effective natural selection could be in creating new species and exterminating old ones. At this point in the play, my second character walks on. Moto Kimura, author of the book The Neutral Theory of Molecular Evolution, published in 1983, more than 100 years after Darwin's masterpiece. Kimura was a Japanese geneticist who came as a student to work with Sewell Wright at the University of Wisconsin. Sewell Wright was one of the biologists who explored the evolutionary implications of Mendel after Mendel's paper was rediscovered in 1900. I was lucky to meet Sewell Wright, accidentally, at the faculty club at the University of Wisconsin in 1987. I was visiting the university and went to the faculty club for lunch. Sitting alone at a small table was a lively old man who turned out to be Sewell Wright, then 98 years old, but still in full possession of his wits. He gave me a detailed first-hand account how he read Mendel's paper and decided to devote his life to understanding the consequences. Wright understood that the inheritance of genes would cause a fundamental randomness in the evolutionary process. The phenomenon of randomness in evolution was called genetic drift. Kimura came to Wisconsin to learn about genetic drift and then returned to Japan. He built genetic drift into a mathematical theory which he called the neutral theory of molecular evolution. After the discovery of the structure of DNA by Crick and Watson in 1953, Kimura knew that genes are molecules carrying genetic information in a simple code. His theory implied that evolution is driven by the statistical evolution of molecules. He called it the neutral theory because it introduced genetic drift as a driving force of evolution, independent of natural selection. I never met Kimura, but he was still alive when I began to study his work, and I was delighted to receive a personal message of encouragement from him before he died in 1974. Kimura did not prove that Darwin's theory was wrong, but he proved that Darwin's theory was incomplete. Darwin missed genetic drift, which is sometimes important and sometimes not. The evolutionary effects of natural selection are generally independent of the size of the population, while the effects of genetic drift depend strongly on population size. Other things being equal, the rate of genetic drift is proportional to the inverse square of the population size. The inverse square root, inverse square root of population size. The inverse square root is a simple consequence of the statistics of independent random variables. The average of any n independent variables varies at a rate inversely proportional to the square root of n. For any firmly established species with a population measured in millions or billions, genetic drift is negligible, natural selection is dominant, and the Darwin theory is valid. For a newly emerging or endangered species with populations measured in tens or hundreds, genetic drift dominates, selection is relatively unimportant, and the Kimura theory is valid. The random jumps of genes in a small population produce evolutionary change much faster than the gentle push of natural selection. Kimura understood that genetic drift is the main driving force in the quick jumps when species are created or extinguished. Kimura's theory explains the beetle paradox that puzzled Darwin. Why are we surrounded by such an astonishing diversity of birds and insects and microbes? Kimura explains the mystery by invoking genetic drift, which suddenly becomes rapid and effective just when it's needed, when small populations can vary fast enough to become genetically isolated and form new species. Genetic drift in local enclaves gives to every large established species the power to diversify. At the ragged edges of small populations where random jumps prevail, speciation is driven by Kimura's neutral theory. Darwin's theory is still true away from the edges, where selection has time to operate on big populations. After Kimura, our third character comes on stage. She is Ursula Goodenough, a biologist born in 1943 and still active at Washington University in St. Louis. Like Darwin and unlike Kimura, she is an observer and experimenter. She gave us another important insight into the mystery of diversity. She analyzed public reports on the rate of random genetic mutation in genes of various kinds in many different sexually reproducing species, all the way from algae to humans. She noted that in a large number of species, there are two families of genes that have mutation rates much higher than average genes. The two families both have specialized functions. One of the families is genes involved with the immune system. There's an obvious reason for immune function genes to mutate rapidly. They have to respond rapidly with production of fresh antibodies to detect and kill invading microbes. The other rapidly existing family of genes is involved with sexual mating. Goodenough observed that there is a systematic tendency for any genes active in the rituals of mating to mutate fast. The reason for this accelerated variation of mating genes is not obvious. Nature is forcing genetic drift to move faster in mating systems than in other bodily functions. If this is generally true, as Goodenough observes, it means genetic drift in mating systems must have a special importance as a driving force of evolution. She proposes a general theory to explain the facts. In the big picture of life evolving over billions of years, established species with large populations evolve slowly and have a mainly conservative effect on the balance of nature. The big jumps in evolution occur when established species become extinct and new species with small populations diversify. The big jumps made by new species are driven by genetic drift. For small populations to form new species, they must become genetically isolated. The rapid change of mating systems is nature's quick way to genetic isolation. Goodenough concludes, the rapid mutation of mating systems is nature's way of achieving big jumps in large-scale evolution. Rapidly evolving mating systems gave nature the diversity of species that astonished Darwin. 20 years ago, Goodenough wrote a paper with the title Rapid Evolution of Sex-Related Genes, describing her observations and her conclusions. I consider this paper a great piece of work, a classic comparable with the books of Darwin and Kimura. But there is an orthodox dogma prevalent among molecular biologists saying that natural selection operates only on individual genes in individual organisms and does not operate on groups or species as a whole. Goodenough goes flatly against this dogma when she suggests the selection of genes promoting rapid speciation is the main driving force of evolution. Her theory of evolution explicitly gives the interest of the species priority over the interest of the individual. Darwin himself did not believe that dogma. The title of his book shows he considered natural selection to operate directly on species, not only on individuals. The dogma arose in the community of molecular biologists. They became intoxicated with the beauty and simplicity of the DNA molecule. It seems to them that evolution was reduced to simple chemistry, and the chemistry of DNA could only act on individual genes. But as usual, the real world of nature is more complicated. The picture of nature revealed by Kimura and Goodenough is new and striking. Nature loves to gamble. Nature thrives by taking risks. She scrambles mating systems so as to increase the risk that individual parents will fail to find mates. The increase of risk of sterility of individuals is a part of nature's plan. She imposes the increased risk on the whole population so that a rare event will occur with greater probability when a pair of lucky parents whose names might happen to be Adam and Eve are born with matching mating systems unlike their contemporaries. That rare event gives one pair of parents a chance to give birth to a new species. Nature knows how to play the odds. By putting her thumb on the mating system mutation scale, she increases the risk of sterility for parents and increases the chance that a lucky pair will start a new species. Nature knows in the long run, established species are expendable and new species are essential. That's why nature is ruthless to the individual and generous to the emerging species. Risk-taking is the key to long-term survival and is also the mother of diversity. So with three characters on stage, it would appear our play is coming close to an end. But then a fourth character bursts in, jumping back 100 years into the past and telling a different story. His name is Herbert Wells. Born in 1866, educated as a biologist, but using his knowledge of biology to give us a fresh view of evolution. The first three characters thought of evolution as a biological process governed by the rules of inheritance from parent to offspring. Wells saw biological evolution as only a part of a bigger story. The other half of the story is cultural evolution, the story of changes in the life of our planet caused by the spread of ideas rather than by the spread of genes. Cultural evolution had its beginnings as soon as animals with brains evolved, using their brains to store information and using patterns of behavior to share it with their offspring. Social species of insects and mammals were molded by cultural as well as biological evolution. But cultural evolution only became dominant when a single species, ourselves, invented spoken language. Spoken language is incomparably more nimble than the language of the genes. Wells saw we happen to live after a massive shift in the history of our planet, caused by the emergence of our own species. The shift was completed about 10,000 years ago when we invented agriculture and started to domesticate animals. Before the shift, evolution was mostly biological. After the shift, it was mostly cultural. Biological evolution is usually slow, big populations enduring for thousands or millions of generations. Cultural evolution can be 1,000 times faster, with major changes occurring in 2 or 3 generations. It took about 200,000 years for our species to evolve biologically from its origin in Africa until today. It took only 200 years of cultural evolution to convert us from farmers to city dwellers and to convert a large part of North America from forest to farmland. Besides his expert knowledge of biology, Wells had a deep interest in the lives of ordinary human beings, with their destiny governed by ancient human emotions of love and hate, fear and greed. He began his professional life as a novelist, telling stories, bringing his characters vivid to life. His view of the human condition can be seen more clearly in his novels than in his biology. One of his novels is Tono Bungay, written in 1912. The narrator, George Ponderevo, is a young man, a capable crook, who is at home in the chaotic world of 20th century capitalism. The chief character is his uncle, Teddy Ponderevo, an amiable swindler who invented the wonder drug Tono Bungay, guaranteed to cure all diseases and bring us health and wealth and happiness. George knows how to keep the cash flowing with raucous advertising campaigns and sales of shares in fraudulent companies. For a while, Tono Bungay is a bubble making them rich. Then the bubble bursts and they are hunted criminals. Uncle Teddy dies in the crash of a homemade airship. George escapes in his private warship, which he happens to own. The last chapter of the novel is entitled Night and the Open Sea, with George's ship swiftly and silently slicing through the dark waves. Wells is writing with a premonition of the horrors of World War I, which broke out 2 years later, destroying millions of lives who would sacrifice themselves to the tribal gods of empire and country. The owners of warships would survive to find new victims. That was very much a part of Wells's view of life, that it is evil as well as good as driving the story. Another novel, The Time Machine, is concerned directly with evolution. The time traveler finds himself in the future, 800,000 years ahead of today. Wells draws one of the bleakest pictures of the future ever imagined. Humans have evolved downhill into two degenerate species, predators and prey, with diminished bodies and diminished minds. The predators are the Morlocks, living like rats in the cellars of ruined buildings. The prey are the Eloi, living aimless lives on the surface in beautiful surroundings, tended like cattle by the Morlocks as a source of meat. The time traveler befriends an Eloi girl who gives him 2 flowers to take home with him. The story ends with the time traveler vanished in another trip in the future, leaving behind the 2 withered flowers. The flowers are proof that even after the spark of reason has been extinguished, friendship and gratitude live on in the human soul. Wells's biggest work is The Outline of History. Published in 1920, a picture of cultural evolution as the main theme of history. He begins with a proud claim: this outline of history is an attempt to tell truly and clearly in one narrative the whole story of life and mankind as far as it is known. The next 50 pages describe the biological evolution up to the rise of the 2 human species, modern man and Neanderthal man. The famous picture by the illustrator John Horrobin shows Wells's literary rival, George Bernard Shaw, as a Neanderthal emerging from a cave, with the cartoon, our Neolithic ancestor, our Neanderthal ancestor, not actually a Neanderthal, but a parallel species. The recent discovery of a substantial fraction of Neanderthal genes in modern Europeans shows that Wells's joke came close to the truth. After the Neanderthals come the cave painters in France and Spain. Cultural evolution has begun and dominates the story from that time forward. Halfway through the story comes the birth of the great world religions: Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Wells tells the story of those religions with a sympathetic eye, recognizing their crucial importance in the cultural evolution. He gives an evocative account of the life and death of Jesus with a memorable Horrobin illustration: 3 crosses on the hill of Golgotha in evening twilight. The caption says, "The darkness closed upon the hill. The distant city set about its preparations for the Passover. Scarcely anyone but that knot of mourners on their way to their homes troubled whether Jesus of Nazareth was still dying or already dead." From Golgotha, the story continues, with empires rising and falling, wars and pestilences raging, wealth and industry growing, and always quietly in the background, the great religions with their holy books, preserving the words of the prophets, raising the hopes of powerless people with visions of a better world. The history ends with the catastrophe of World War I, and with the abortive attempt still in progress while Wells was writing to establish a League of Nations with effective power to keep the world at peace. As a result of cultural evolution, a single species now dominates the ecology of our planet, and cultural evolution will dominate the future of life so long as any species with a living culture survives. When we look ahead to imagine possible futures, cultural evolution must be our dominant concern. But biological evolution has not stopped and will not stop. As cultural evolution races ahead like a hare biological evolution will continue its tortoise crawl to shape our destiny. I'm ignorant of Chinese history and literature, so I discuss only the Western part of cultural evolution. In Western culture, we see a series of creative events occurring in small urban communities. Jerusalem around 1000 BC, inventing monotheistic religion. Athens around 500 BC, inventing philosophy and drama and democratic government. Florence around 1500 AD, inventing modern art and science. Manchester around 1750 AD, inventing modern industry. In each case, a small population produced a starburst of pioneers who permanently changed our way of thinking. Genius erupted in groups as well as in individuals. It seems likely that these bursts of creative change were driven by a combination of cultural with biological evolution. Cultural evolution was constantly spreading ideas and skills from one community to another, stirring up conservative societies with imported novelties. But at the same time, biological evolution acting on small, genetically isolated populations was causing genetic drift, so that the average intellectual endowment of an isolated community was rising and falling by random chance. Over the last few thousand years, genetic drift caused occasional starbursts to occur when small populations rose to outstandingly high levels of average ability. The combination of imported new ideas with peaks of genetic drift would enable local communities to change the world. The big uncertainty in this picture of genetic drift is the genetic isolation of small communities. We have no reliable information about the mating habits of the populations of Jerusalem and Athens and Florence and Manchester during the centuries just before they became creative. They were to some extent isolated geographically, but they were also divided into tribes and hereditary classes that were isolated socially. Class prejudice and snobbery were probably the most powerful causes of genetic isolation, and those are not measurable quantities. The contribution of genetic drift to cultural evolution remains a hypothesis. When we look to the future, it is convenient to divide it into near and far. The near future is the next century for which we can make some reliable predictions. The far future is everything beyond. In the near future, we can be sure that genetic drift is fading rapidly as a driving force of change. All over the world, humans are moving from villages into big cities where genetic drift is negligible, and in the populations that are still geographically isolated, humans are less socially isolated by barriers of class and race. It's unlikely that any town in the next century will be another Athens or another Jerusalem. Wells ends his outline with a glimpse of the far future where nothing is certain and all predictions are guesswork. In the far future, it's likely that humans and other forms of life will spread out to great distances in the universe. If our destiny takes us to the stars, our descendants will again be genetically isolated, and genetic drift will resume its ancient power to mold our life into new patterns of diversity. The strongest driving force of cultural evolution today is science. Science is the international enterprise that brings us together most powerfully in a common purpose, requiring us to share ideas and tools, economic resources and material benefits. The task of East and West in this century will be to work together as friends in science and technology while respecting our differences in politics and culture. When we look to the future beyond 1 or 2 centuries, expansion of the domain of life into the universe will be inevitable and also desirable for many reasons. Inevitable because biotechnology and space technology will provide the means for life to make the big jump. Desirable because the cultural evolution of creative new societies requires more elbow room than a single planet can provide. Creative new societies need room to take risks and make mistakes, far enough away to be effectively isolated from their neighbors. Life must spread far afield to continue the processes of genetic drift and diversification of species which drove evolution in the past. The restless wandering that pulled our species out of Africa to explore this planet will continue to pull us beyond the planet as far as our technology can reach. Wells has been monopolizing our stage for too long, so it's time for our 5th actor, Richard Dawkins, to have his turn. Wells was at heart a novelist, portraying history as a story of human beings with ideas and emotions, as well as neurons and genes. Dawkins is a biologist who began his career with the study of animal behavior, only later transferring his attention to humans. Dawkins published his great work, The Selfish Gene, in 1976. He's interested in general patterns of behavior rather than individual humans. His book portrays human society as a mechanical system of agents with behavior governed by genes, similar to a collection of machines with behavior governed by computer programs. The selfish gene is a device with a single purpose: to achieve its own survival and replication. It is not concerned with our welfare or with our human needs. Dawkins caused a revolution in our thinking with his insight that the selfish behavior of genes can explain the unselfish behavior of humans. His book is a classic because he makes a convincing case for a paradoxical conclusion that selfish genes can orchestrate the evolution of cooperation, generosity, and self-sacrifice in humans. He succeeds brilliantly in reducing our high moral principles and our ethical beliefs to the action of unthinking and uncaring molecules of DNA. In the final chapter of his book, Dawkins turns his attention to cultural evolution and introduces another innovation to our thinking. The new idea is the meme, the cultural analog to the gene. A meme is a unit of cultural behavior, as a gene is a unit of biological behavior. Examples of memes are ideas, customs, slogans, fashions in dress or in hairstyle, skills, tools, laws, religions, beliefs, and political institutions. Memes spread through human populations by social contact far more rapidly than genes spread by sexual contact. Just as our behavior at the individual level is controlled by selfish genes, our behavior at the social level is controlled by selfish memes. Dawkins' vision of human society as the visible face of an invisible network of selfish genes and memes is to a large extent true. His book gave us a new understanding of the evolution of morality and religion. But Dawkins' vision is not the whole truth. Human nature hides mysteries which genes and memes do not illuminate. Shakespeare and Mozart created new worlds of literature and music. Jesus wandered in the wilderness for 40 days and emerged as a revolutionary force that transformed a large part of the planet for 2,000 years. Dawkins imagines that genes and memes will explain those mysteries. Nobody can prove that Dawkins is wrong, but his claims are open to reasonable doubt. It is reasonable to accept his view of genes and memes as a powerful agents of human behavior, but to reject his view that they explain everything. Unfortunately, as often happens in the history of philosophy, the disciples of the master are more dogmatic than the master himself. Molecular biologists who borrowed ideas from Dawkins became more dogmatic than Dawkins. Their dogmatic belief blinds them to the evidence collected by Goodenough for biological selection working directly on species. Cultural evolution also works directly on species, but in a radically different way, as our last actor discovered. So, our sixth and last actor, Svante Pääbo, born in 1955, now a world leader in the study of human genomes, he comes to the stage with startling news. After long struggles, his team of paleontologists and chemists in Leipzig have developed the technology for sequencing ancient DNA degraded and contaminated with modern DNA. They have succeeded in sequencing accurately the genomes of our Neanderthal cousins who lived in Europe about 50,000 years ago, and they also sequenced genomes of our own species who lived in Europe at the same time, and genomes of a third species called Denisovans, because they were found in a Denisova cave in Siberia. He published the story of the sequencing and the surprising results in his book, Neanderthal Man in Search of Lost Genomes, in 2014. When he compared the ancient genomes of those three species with modern humans, he saw abundant evidence of mixing. Modern humans originating in Europe and Asia, but not in Africa, carry several percent of Neanderthal genes. Modern humans in Papua New Guinea carry several percent of Denisovan. The ancient genomes come from times when the severe climate of the last ice age prevailed in Europe and northern Asia. Humans and their cousins were precariously surviving in caves, where they probably sat huddled around the cave fire to keep warm, cooking their dinner and telling stories. It now appears that the three species frequently sat around the cave fires together rather than separately. They mated and raised families together. Our species had larger populations and supplied most of the genes to the mixed offspring. But the Neanderthals and the Denisovans never became extinct. They simply merged their genomes with ours. They survived as a part of our genetic inheritance. The discoveries of Svante Pääbo show that as early as 50,000 years ago, the transition from biological to cultural evolution was already far advanced. Biological evolution, as demonstrated by Kimura and Goodenough, accelerates the birth of new species by favoring the genetic isolation of small populations. Cultural evolution had the opposite effect, erasing differences between related species and bringing them together. Cultural evolution happens when cousins learn each other's languages and share their stories around the cave fire. As a consequence of cultural evolution, biological differences become less important and cousins learn to live together in peace. Sharing of memes brings the species together, and sharing of genes is the unintended consequence. In the long-range history of life, the transition from biological to cultural evolution was an event of transcendent importance. We became aware of its importance only recently as a result of the discoveries of stunt Pablo. The transition caused a reversal of the direction of evolution from diversification to unification, from the proliferation of diverging species to the union of species into a brotherhood of man. We see a small-scale example of this transition in the recent history of racism. Until recently, racism was a force of nature, favoring the diversification of species. Humans traditionally hated and despised people of a different skin color. The natural evolutionary consequence would have been the division of our species into three: one pink, one black, and one yellow. Only in the last few centuries, a strong reaction against racism has emerged. Interracial marriage has become respectable, and the cultural unification of our species has pushed us towards biological unification. This is a small step in the long history of the transition of human society from incessant warfare to brotherhood. With our 6 actors all on stage, the play begins and my talk ends. The great task of our species in the next few centuries is to make brotherhood effective and permanent. Our new understanding of biological and cultural evolution will help us to see more clearly what we have to do. The American University in Beirut will have an important part to play in the future, as it has in the past, promoting brotherhood in the crucial area of the Middle East, the cradle of Western civilization, which became a cauldron of hatred and bloodshed. I do not presume to tell the university how to solve its problems. I end my talk by thanking you all for your attention and for the honor you have given me today. Thank you. Thank you all, and now we have the questions. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. So
may I take this opportunity, one, to thank you again for this wonderful discourse. And just to tell you, you may already know it, a little story about the American University of Beirut and that gentleman who wrote The Origins. Darwin never visited Beirut, but in 1882, I'm guessing a month after he passed away, a chemist on the faculty named Edwin Lewis gave a commencement address in which he extolled Darwinism. And as a consequence of it, war broke out on the campus. Nearly half the faculty resigned or were forced to resign. Some did it under their own will. Many, many students were thrown out. And the then president, who was an Amherst College and founder of the university, issued what he called a Christian Declaration of Principles that all faculty had to subscribe to. And it lasted for 20 years, and then that was tossed out. But what's, I think, most interesting is that many of these missionaries who were teaching there, Americans from the top schools in this country, learned Arabic. And a number of the courses they were teaching in the Arabic language. When they disappeared, because of their support for evolutionary theory, Arabic could no longer, there were not enough faculty to teach in Arabic, so English, it devolved into English, a kind of devolution. And so the university has been forever after taught in the English language. But Darwin had had a large impact on that university, our university. So just, yeah.
No, I've not heard that story
Yeah.
before. That's quite remarkable.
Yes, it's not a question, it was just a little history. Our great.
Thank you, Philip, and we've had this extraordinary presentation taking us into history and into ideas, and this is what AUB does, this is what great scholarship does, and this is what great humanism does, and AUB and this leadership in this room brings us all together and reminds us of the continuing challenges we have. We only have, we also have the challenge of time. We should have only 5-10 minutes or so. Ada, you will have to tell us when to break.
We can go.
Yeah, and we have questions, comments from AUB in Beirut and our great transcontinental exchange that continues. So I would like to take the questions and comments from Beirut. Jihad, if you can see one or two, try to keep them short so we have time here to hear Professor Dyson, and then we will come back here and get some comments and questions here. Go ahead. Turn on your microphones there when you speak. Maybe we'll. Sorry.
Was that the problem?
Maybe.
Maybe. Try that.
Try it now.
Yeah.
Good. That's all right. Good work.
Go ahead.
Hello. First, I would like to thank the team who organized this fantastic event and initiative. My question to Professor Dyson: at some point in history, separating science from philosophy was essential for science to progress, as it freed from old-fashioned beliefs and perceptions. And of course, when we separated science from philosophy, we also separated science from wisdom. So there was a price to pay. And of course, we had this cost-benefit balance. Benefits of science outweighed the cost of losing wisdom. And we've seen this reflection perhaps when the first dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But now, of course, we benefit a lot from science. My question, how long this dynamics, how long it would outweigh cost? And now with we don't have only nuclear, that we have so many science and technology-based economic risks, such as cybersecurity, biological weapons, climate change. So at some point, does Professor Dyson perceive that these risks would shift the balance so the cost would outweigh the benefits of science? And what should we do then? Thank you.
So I'm sorry I couldn't really understand the question. Can you repeat it?
Let's turn this mic back on.
It was essentially talking about how throughout history there has been a separation between science and philosophy and politics and other dimensions. And in today's world, are we running a great risk of losing something important if science continues to take a backseat and is separated from wisdom?
The answer is, of course, yes. Being an intelligent species is a risky game, and that is a big part of it. I mean, there's always a big chance when you're going into new territory culturally that you'll be in a blind alley and you'll do all kinds of desperate things which turn out to be disasters. That's the risks that nature always takes, and we have to take it too.
Okay, another question, comment from Beirut, and then we'll come back here.
Maybe on a different mic.
Using a different microphone possibly. By the way, that last speaker was Professor Ali Ahmed, who is in charge of research on nuclear energy and power in the Middle East. Formerly was a research scholar at Princeton for many years.
Okay. I'm eager to hear your take on why two very intelligent people like yourself and Richard Dawkins to find it difficult to accept something like or to converge. I mean, I'm talking about Dawkins in particular. Why doesn't he accept group selection in principle? It seems to be that it would be something that would be a matter of, a case-by-case argument, different particular phenomena. Why do you think he doesn't accept it in principle?
Did you get that?
Yeah, it just always seemed to be obvious that group selection was real. I mean, if you just read Darwin's book, it's right there. I've never seen any particular reason to doubt it, but there is this dogmatic belief to the contrary, and that's something we have to live with too.
If we could take some questions and comments here, please, and introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. This is Jinan Melouf. Thank you so much for, I'm right here. Thank you so much for stimulating us intellectually this morning. Can you hear me or no?
Yeah, just speak up a little bit.
Raise your voice a bit.
Okay, sorry. So I was saying thank you so much for stimulating us intellectually this morning. One quick question for you, or maybe two quick questions. How did you go about handpicking the 6 characters and throwing Ursula into the equation? Was it a complete random act, or was she chosen on purpose?
So what was the question?
How did you pick those 6 characters, and how did you throw Ursula into the equation?
Well, the reason I chose them was it seemed to me they were the people who had actually had all the good ideas. And of course, Ursula in particular, I know her personally. So I think she deserves far more respect than she gets. And that's, of course, an old story that there is some tendency to downgrade people just because of the color of their genomes. And anyhow, that's at least to me, she's one of the greats.
Okay, thank you.
Tfaddal back there. Introduce yourself, please.
Yusuf Zain, member of the International Advisory Council of the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much. Linking history to genetics to the future is just unbelievable. But one thought I just had listening intensely to what you're saying seems to be that one of the things that AUB should be doing is to integrate genetic research with historical research. That in an area where, Lebanon is a very funny place in many ways. We're 10,000 square kilometers, and we have 14 different dialects. Dialects cannot emerge except with genetic seclusion, because then, even Beirut has 3 different dialects, which means that people live within the same 10 square kilometers, completely separated, just like the cave people were sitting around their campfires, completely separated from each other. And in many ways, the history of the whole region is a history made of separation of people, seclusion of people, to which we today find ourselves in great quandary, because that seclusion is coming down and people are suddenly discovering how different they are from each other. and not being able to integrate that difference into something productive and useful. And it seems to me that that's something which is, there's a lot of work I know that be happening at the American University of Beirut Medical Center of genetic research that's fascinating, of between different people secluded in different regions of the country, that I can see your linkage, and I would hope that AUB would circulate this unbelievable speech of yours today. We will not only know why these people were chosen, but maybe we can even add to that. But thank you very much. This gives quite a lot of ideas for how we might be able to deal with some problems into the future. You're projecting history in your attitude.
No, well, I'm happy to add to that I have a colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton who is a professional historian who is now engaged in genetics, studying the ancient DNA, especially in northern Italy, and tracing the barbarian invasions that overtook the Roman Empire 1600 years ago. So this is a lively part of history today as a result of genetics.
Thank you for a beautiful lecture. Huda Zagbi, a trustee of the university. I really enjoyed your characters and theater metaphor to understand biology and humanity all together in one. To build more on your cultural evolution discussion and how important that is, let's push that a little bit further and think how that might actually modify our genome. I'm sure you're aware that today we know that the environment, our experiences, as well as our environment, what we eat, what we experience, does actually modify our gene function, in part through what we understand through epigenetics. I'm curious if you were to pick one more character to add to this mix that will help us figure out this cultural genome relationship, who would that be?
Yes, well, actually, I'm not an expert on the history of genetics, and I can't answer the question. I'll think about it.
If I could, Professor President Khoury, or let me ask you a quick question. You said you don't think there will be another city that will do what Athens and Jerusalem and others did. Do you think one day people might say Silicon Valley did that, or not necessarily?
Well, of course, it's too early to tell, of course, but Silicon Valley undoubtedly plays an important part in history, but it's not clear whether it has anything to do with evolution.
So, Professor Dyson, you honor us with your history and you flatter us because as a simple physician who grew up in a household with a mathematician, a biophysicist, he was a doctor, but he called himself a biophysicist, and a physicist, a physician was considered to be a species somewhere below a plumber, although we are, of course, biologists. So your emphasis on the role of genetic evolution is intriguing, interlinked with cultural evolution. However, we're in a period of unusual resistance, shall we say, to cultural evolution across different parts of the planet, including in Europe, and perhaps some advocacy, even from the president of this country, of less cultural intermixing, less cultural diversification. And that's a particularly stark possibility for a small patch of area that I agree with you is the birthplace of Western civilization, which is the Middle East, because it's a crowded area, a lot of economic, political, and other challenges. How do you see getting this message across of the importance of the intermixing of cultures and genes in that part of the world? How do we move that forward? So that's part of our mission.
And after Professor Dyson answers that, we'll go back to Beirut. So in Beirut, if there are comments and questions, please be ready to step in. But if you could answer this question,
Yeah,
this comment
well,
first.
no, I agree with you that I better not start digressing, but so I mean, I think the answer simply is yes. It's here from Beirut.
Let's go back to Beirut, and any comments or questions from there? Okay. Anybody ready, Jed? Turn on the mic, please.
Yes, I actually have two questions. One pertaining to Freeman's lecture, another pertaining to his body of work and its relevance to the current moment we are in. So I start with lecture. We live in a context where it seems cultural evolution seems to be driving the development of isolated communities. Isolated communities which, when they come into contact, can also unleash catastrophic events. So it seems that the large-scale phenomena associated with cultural evolution are also selecting the development of isolation. Where does this fit in the framework that I've described? The other question pertains to events which I will touch on your career. One is the move question nuclear treaty, which brought about a period of reasonable stability around the Cold War. And the other is the recent awarding of a Nobel Prize to the House. And I would like to hear your opinion on work, possibility of actually developing models which allow us to couple the economy to climate in the way he has.
What was the second one? The Nobel Prize?
Nordhaus, William Nordhaus at Yale won the Economics Prize, shared it this year, and for his work in environmental economics. That's what Chad Duma is asking about. How do you view that and his models?
And he also asked your views on the breaking up of the nuclear treaty, that the disarmament treaty that Trump is trying to get out of with the Russians. And he just announced this, and do you have any views on the possible implications of that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to get into local politics, but I think the first question, I thought it concerns whether we're actually driving toward greater isolation.
Cultural isolation, yeah, that was the first one.
And I would say no. I mean, the fact that the biggest influence in the last 10 or 20 years is cell phones. The whole world has been brought together by cell phones in on a much larger scale than these local enclaves of old-fashioned thinking. I mean, this is, of course, there will always be enclaves of old-fashioned thinking, and they're desirable in the right circumstances. So we ought to be diverse in our ways of thinking, and I'm not against that. But I think the tendency now, on the whole, is much more in the direction of unification. When you look at what's actually happened in the real world, something like half the population of the world has cell phones, and that makes an enormous change on a much more fundamental level than the local groups who want to preserve old customs. So the second question was for
the Nobel Prize in Economics?
Yes, I won't say anything about that, I think, because I simply don't. I mean, I like Nordhaus. I've read stuff he wrote, and I liked it very much. So I'm sure he earned his Nobel Prize, but I don't know much about the details.
So we'll take two more questions here, and then I think we have to break. So Rima, and then
My question to you, first, it's a fascinating lecture, and actually, I'm not a scientist, so for me it was much more informative than I expected. I learned a lot. I got curious. I mean, I learned from you that the trajectory that humanity will take into the future does not follow a deterministic model. It depends on what we do. This is where cultural evolution gets in. My question is this cultural and biological revolution also reversible by human choice? I mean, can we do something to take us back rather than into the future? You spoke about interracial marriages. Now, if people are going back to racial supremacy scientific models, can we go back?
So we could go back, but it's not very likely. I mean, it is going back always has unintended consequences, and you're not really back where you thought you might be. So I would say mostly going back is an illusion. But I mean, it was. You can never tell, but I mean, of course, everything is unpredictable. But the culture is at least as complicated as nature, and both of them are totally unpredictable.
Fadda.
Thank you. I'm Salam Haykal. I'm a trustee of the university. So what I understood is that genes spread much slower than memes. And genes are based on the survival of the fittest. So the fittest is by definition is the one that survives. It's easy to understand who's the fittest. In memes, we have different cultures, and the question is, how do you actually define which is a cultural trait that is fitter in a certain cultural context? Because that is going to define the conflicts between cultures eventually.
Yes, and of course that's a job for lawyers, not for scientists. Most of the interesting things you can't really define. It's of course the lawyers have to do that, but the edges are always vague, and especially when it's anything to do with culture. So there are certain types of behavior which are clearly well defined, and especially there are various forms of religion which adopt very strict rules about who is a brother and who is not. But if you take religion as a whole, of course, it's enormously diverse.
President Hudi, would you like to make a closing comment?
I'd like to thank Dr. Dyson. He never fails to surprise all of us with his opinions and his views. This was a wonderful, eye-opening lecture. I'm still taking notes to try to fathom the six that you chose and some that you didn't. But I certainly think you opened our eyes as you have opened people's eyes for generations. And for that, we thank you, Professor Dyson. Thank you.